episode of the podcast, JR chats with ObjectSharp's DevOps champion, Jeff Zado, about what's buzzing in the world of DevOps today. Plus, Jeff talks about why listening before solutioning is critical for an organization's success with DevOps.
Welcome to another episode of the ObjectSharp podcast. I am actually delighted that for the first time, I have Jeff on the other side of the discussion. Usually, Jeff, you're like a co-host or have been a co-host of this conversation. Now I get to have you on the other side in the hot seat. So welcome to the hot seat.
Thank you, JR. Yeah, it's different being on this side, but I look very forward to a great conversation and dialogue with you.
Well, you know what? Why don't we just start off right away with the cleverness of your title? So, you know, at ObjectSharp, you are known as the DevOps champion. Tell me what that means, or sorry, DevOps advocate, right? What does that actually mean?
So, ObjectSharp, you know, we're a very focused company, right? And from a technical standpoint, there are leaders for certain technologies. And from a business standpoint, there are some of us that have a greater affinity and interest based upon our careers and history in certain areas. And, you know, when I think back over my career spanning well over 20 years, I won't tell you how long it is, you know, from a tooling chain that really leads up to what is DevOps and how this is changing organizations. It's been part of my entire career since I graduated from University of Waterloo, right? And so it is a personal interest of mine. It's something that I've always been around. And more importantly, it's something that I've engaged with hundreds and hundreds of companies about through my career spanning software companies and Microsoft and now ObjectSharp. So it's something that's near and dear to my heart.
Awesome. Well, and that's actually one of the reasons why I asked you on the show, because, you know, as you're going around and you're talking to different clients and you're talking to, you know, developers and anybody and everyone who wants to hear about DevOps, what I've heard you talk about is kind of like these newish terms that are coming out, or these new concepts. Like, probably by this point, everybody knows about your traditional DevOps as a mindset, as a way of getting into organizations. But as DevOps has sort of evolved over time, it seems like it's grown up a little. And so what I thought we could do today is just kind of poke your brains at what has grown up or what has changed over the last little while in the DevOps space. And I'll throw some words at you that I've sort of been hearing, kind of listening out there in social media world and stuff like that, just to see what you have to say about that and what you're hearing from others about it. How does that sound?
Sure. It sounds good. Can I say bingo every once in a while when we get to a critical mass of buzzwords that are out there?
Hey, you're in the hot seat, my friend. So you can do whatever you want. So the first one I have for you is, tell me what, like, a lot of times I see online and I like postings for DevOps engineer or like the DevOps person. I see you're chuckling already. On the one hand, it's like, okay, so DevOps is a thing that people do. So how does that translate into a DevOps engineer?
Yeah, it's, you know, I remember back to the early days when DevOps as a word sort of first came out in the industry. I was at Microsoft at the time, and it was very common for people, and it still is today, to say, I want to hire a DevOps engineer, right? And, you know, my statement to organizations was, you can have people called that, but it's a mindset that the whole organization has to rally around. Similar to when we think about Agile, right? You can't just have one person in a team doing Agile stuff, whatever that means to them, and them being successful at that. So, you know, DevOps for me is very much first about the people, the process that support the people, and the tools that support the process for what the organization is trying to do, right? So it is common nowadays, as much as I struggled against that in the early days, saying you shouldn't have DevOps engineers. Every organization we're working with, call them DevOps engineers. What they do is a bit different between different organizations, but it is very much an organization that is rallying around, what is it trying to do for the business? And for the most case, what that means is, especially when we think about the climate in the world that we're living in, and the new era of opportunity that's going to open up for organizations as the vaccine becomes more available, is it's allowing organizations to respond to a situation more quickly, whether that's a bad situation or a good opportunity situation. And as that relates to organizations, it's aligning the people and it's aligning the process and a lot around automation to basically help people move forward. So the title is interesting because even the name, which you'll get into later on, has changed and morphed so much that it depends upon what it is. But it really is a cultural and a mind shift for an organization that everyone, their roles are going to change. Whether there's a group responsible for it, everyone else has to align around that as well, right? And change how they do things to be successful at it.
So in other words, I may actually be a DevOps engineer and I don't even know it. So let's flip that around so that I can see whether I do in fact know it. If someone were to come to you and say, hey, Jeff, like, do you know any DevOps engineers? Right. So what does that mean to you? Like, how would I know if I'm a DevOps engineer?
Yeah. So, a core component, I'd say, to DevOps and to engineering and stuff like that, it is scripting, right? It's the predictability of things, right? And there are a lot of different tool chains, as they call it, right, that support that, right? And you can't really talk about DevOps without talking about tooling. And unfortunately, a lot of people just focus just on the tooling, which I think is short-sighted. Like, a DevOps engineer is one that is constantly sort of looking at, how can I further automate? How can I be more responsive to the business and what I need to do? And that can cross everything from, in the typical areas we talk about with continuous integration, continuous deployment, right, and getting stuff out there, but from test, right? In the big area really that is eye-opening for a lot of organizations is how it relates to the underlying platform that runs these solutions, the infrastructure, as we like to call it, whether that be on-premise or in the cloud or in a hosted data center, it doesn't really matter, right? But it's the thinking about, right, of how do I improve this? How do I work better with all the different roles and people in the organization to help the business goal, not just help the goal as probably set out in my performance plan, write an application, deploy an application, right? Success is when all of these things align to deliver value for the business.
Okay, so that kind of gets me thinking about, because you mentioned scripting, and I know a lot of DevOps work is considered typically on the infrastructure side. So that's kind of where infrastructure as code now is starting to pop up in a lot of these job postings for DevOps engineers. So tell me a little bit more about infrastructure as code and what that's, like what's that all about?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because when we're talking to organizations that are just starting, I'll call it their journey, right? And typically, a lot of DevOps stuff, the pressure in an organization to really look at DevOps, I have seen, at least, has been sort of twofold. When people started getting into mobile apps, right, it forced our organization to rethink how they bring updates and frequency to that, because the mobile app, for the most part, customers, consumers of that application, right, expect more frequent updates, right? We expect that from our phone, whereas enterprise apps, used to be, yearly or biannual or whatever it might be. The cloud is the other big thing. As organizations, and during COVID times, digital transformation and stuff, it's really been pushed a lot for organizations. So infrastructure code is a big thing, because in the past, I remember working in companies where there was sneakernet, right? And for you young people on this podcast, right, it's literally that IT professionals, had sneakers on because they were running from machine to machine to basically pop in floppies. Do you remember those? Right? And update things, right? And so there was a big separation between, I'll call it the IT pro world, as we sort of looked at it, and the development sort of community. And infrastructure as code, right? When we think about it, is I can script everything. I can script what I need, in my underlying Linux distribution to support this application, or Windows. I can script out more advanced cloud native things like PaaS services for what they need. In fact, I can script out my security policies. I can script out my networking, because when we think about in a cloud world, all of this is software defined. which
Right.
means I can write a script for it, which means I can have greater reliability. I can have greater agility to be able to deploy, to revert back to things. And this is a new world for a lot, because a lot of the IT professionals, and when we talk to companies, as much as we talk about tooling can do this and this, in fact, an hour before this call, I was just having a call with a client that started their digital transformation, cloud transformation a couple of years ago. And we were having this very conversation around DevOps. And he goes, I need the people, all the people, not just the developers that get this tool, all the people to understand how they fit into this and how 1 + 1 becomes 3 for what they do. So for IT professionals, scripting, they did PowerShell and all these other things, but to think about version control of my security policies and of my network, it is a new thing for them, and it is incredibly powerful for them. But it means organizations have to learn a new way of doing things, and people have to learn new tools, right, and scripting things to be able to make this possible. So infrastructure as code, to me, is one of those aha moments then when people really understand what this means. And to me, simply, it means I can have a script and a version of that. My infrastructure, my security, my application, my data layer, and a combination of these different versions of these different tiers is what delivers the business value. It allows me to move so much more quickly and have greater insight and control over that process.
Nice. So, you kind of mentioned about how it's kind of expanding and stuff like that now to include, the infrastructure side of things. Again, a lot of the things that I'm seeing out there too, in terms of what it takes to be a DevOps engineer and stuff like that. There's another one out there, DevSecOps, right? And looking for DevSecOps experience. Well, what does that mean?
So, dev, insert whatever word of the day, ops is a, I think back to Unix and regular expressions and stuff like that. So DevSecOps is, when I think about it, right, software development in the past was very siloed, and really it was like you were throwing things over walls to different departments when you had done your face in it, and it made it, inefficient for addressing the business needs. Security is one of those things that in my time frame in this, and especially because we have more public access endpoints to a lot of solutions, whether it be mobile, whether it be web apps, whether it be cloud or not, right? Everyone has a website, and the website just isn't text anymore, right? It's doing things, right? So it's a target. We've seen security breaches increase dramatically during COVID time because everyone is remote, and a lot of this infrastructure is being pushed to beyond its limits in most cases, because no one in the world has worked in a more remote way than we have right now.
Very true.
So DevSecOps is really about thinking about security throughout the entire life chain and automating things as early as possible, because we all have seen those studies that if I catch a bug early in the cycle, that it's dramatically less than trying to fix it later on, right? And typically security was one of those last things that was passed to. We didn't want to talk to security because they're going to say no all the time, because that's their job, right? And so DevSecOps is once again pulling in those people and looking at it. And when we think about, we deal a lot, a lot of my clients deal a lot in the Azure world. When I think about where tools have come, like Azure Security Center or other things, right, or defining policies or just-in-time access for applications, there's so much that you can do to move it earlier, right? And one tangential thing to this is, most of software development is different nowadays, right? When I was young, Lego was really those basic 4 pieces, right? And we all use Lego analogies because it's, well, my kid has millions of dollars in Lego now. But if I look at the Lego that exists today, and I think of, my son that has these Technics projects and motors, they're all these very customized pieces that do amazing things that I couldn't have done before, right? And so when we think about building solutions nowadays, it's not those simple apps that are isolated in simple components, right? We are involving an incredible amount of open source because there's a great community out there that can accelerate, once again, me getting to my business solution. But when I start taking all these pieces and putting them together, it opens up new challenges for me, especially in the security area, to make sure that those underlying components are secure and they're updated. Just like, Patch Tuesday for updating Windows or updating Linux or anything else, it is so important to make that part of the process. And one little tidbit for people that are new to DevOps is, as I mentioned before, when you think about DevOps and you think about how it can tie to infrastructure security and all these other components software defined, I can have a DevOps process just for automatically updating the underlying OS and testing things out with the application, right? Even if the application isn't revving that frequently. But Patch Tuesday is a common thing for a lot of people. And once again, want to automate that to minimize your risk, right, from security threats.
Now, you mentioned moving stuff like earlier in the process. Is that what shifting security left means?
Yep. Shifting left just means to start earlier and have those conversations. And what's funny, JR, is when I think about, the evolution of the tool chain for DevOps, as I like to call it now, and where these things came from, because it started with a lot of sort of source code and what they did, right? Is we've always been expanding the group of people that are involved so that there's a single source of truth and information in this. And security is one of those people, just like when we think about DevOps as a word, right? And expand it, development and operations, because historically there was a big wall in between them. Right? But there's greater efficiencies if we involve operations earlier, because I don't know how many projects, and I'm sure it never happened in the projects you managed as a development manager, that you develop the latest, greatest stuff and libraries and everything else, only to get it to the release point to realize that, oh yeah, we don't plan to upgrade to that version of SQL or Windows for about 6 months. And you're looking at it saying, why did I work so hard and drive the team so hard just to be stopped, right? And this is why we need to align all these people, and security is important. And if you wait to have that conversation later and you don't put automatic things in to scan for security issues and leaving keys and passwords and code, it's only going to lead to disappointment for the business and not the primary objective, which is helping the business succeed, right?
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
It's a lot to take in, I know, and it's a big transformation for organizations, right? And I think hopefully what people are getting through this is, DevOps isn't about throwing a tool at it saying, I'm DevOps now, right? Or in the case of Microsoft, I bought Azure DevOps, therefore I'm DevOps.
Right,
great naming, but it's just a piece of it, right? And you have to change your approach. You have to change your attitude towards these things. Create an environment that is trusting, right? And that people collaborate truly together, not just on the surface, right? And then the tools can really support, right, that mandate for that organization.
You mentioned that it's a lot for organizations and things are shifting and stuff like that. So now again, if I'm a DevOps engineer, because it seems like that's ultimately what we're talking about in this episode, is if I'm going to call myself a DevOps engineer, what do I need to know these days? We talked about infrastructure as code, something I need to know. We talked about DevSecOps. What about data ops, or sometimes ML ops, right? Like, it goes back to what you were saying. It's like, insert whatever word here, ops.
Yeah,
what do I need to know on data ops?
Yeah, so, data drives everything, right? And for the people listening, ML stands for machine learning, right? So if we think of the artificial intelligence or data scientist world and things like that. So, some of the earliest clients that we helped, right, and it was a major financial institution here in Canada, was all around actually enabling the data scientist division, as they called it, to be able to have access to the environment and, more importantly, the data, to be able to do their job and not send a ServiceNow ticket in, for a week or sometime later on for someone to provision an environment and for then it to be populated with data. So right. Data drives everything, right? And I'll give you a very real world example. So I was talking with a client a couple of days ago, the client is fairly, I'll call it cloud savvy, very open to sort of moving forward, starting to understand what DevOps is about. But there's a bit of a challenge between, their different divisions. And data was one of the big things. They said, well, it's hard for us to allow outside contractors to come in because, our best practice is we're grabbing data from production, right, and bringing it into development, and then they're working against that, right? And that's maybe okay for our employees that have basically signed confidentiality agreements and all this other stuff, but we don't have a model to obfuscate that data, right, or to remove the PII to allow others to work with it. And in fact, they didn't have a model by which they could augment that data, and using real world data is great, but you want to put some test records in there that you know what the conditions are to have some test automation for things to fail or pass. And so we started talking to them about DevOps extension to be able to support that, right? So that someone doesn't have to go in there and hand put that data in there, right? That they can automatically take production data and they know what they need to do to take the PII out of it and automatically populate this environment, in this case, for the developers with the press of a button so that they can do what they need to do when they need to do it, right? The financial institution I was talking about before, it was all about actually streaming data from many different sources in an automated fashion to replenish that data. And nowadays, a lot of organizations, as they're looking at things, it's not just the data that they have in the organization, it's getting sediments and information from Twitter, right? Or social media and all that other stuff. There's a plethora of data and open data out there that organizations need to pull in, right, in an automated fashion to allow their efforts to continue moving forward. And that is a perfect thing to automate. And that's a perfect thing for DevOps from that standpoint, right, to be able to do that. So you see DevOps interjecting itself in traditional data land, right, or data scientist land, right? We think about it more traditionally from a developer type land, right? But it goes across everything. Same with security, right? It is something, anyone that touches that process, right, there will be a DevOps piece behind how their role changes in the organization. That's my belief.
Fascinating. Right? Because because you kind of think to yourself, it's like, okay, well, what is that next whatever ops, right? And actually, come to think of it, one popped into my head now. You've been talking a lot about, the automating of infrastructure and stuff like that. But I was having a conversation the other day with someone about serverless. Okay. And the conversation kind of went along this way. It's like, well, if I move everything to serverless things like Azure Functions and whatever, I don't have to deal with infrastructure, and I don't have because there's no servers. And I was kind of like, that there are servers, right? It's just that you're not managing those servers. Yeah. And we were kind of going back and forth. And so that's kind of how thinking about that, how does that fall into our conversations? Like, okay, so, let's say you've done the whole infrastructure as code automation there. You've done the automation for data, but again, that technically goes to some sort of infrastructure, databases, whatever. What about serverless now, right? Like everything is going serverless. In fact, we have, Dave Judd from our team, loves talking about these things and has an entire webinar on just moving over to serverless. So now how does serverless end up in a DevOps world?
It's a great question, right? And I love it when people bring it up saying I'm serverless and I don't, there's no servers. Yeah, you just don't manage it, right? And that's part of, I'll call it the benefit of these new models in which we can work. It allows the business to focus more on the business value or the problem that they're trying to solve and be less distracted by these other things, right? Running wiring, right? Or talking to procurement to buy more capacity, right? To scale up, which is really hard to predict, right? So and I'll talk in the context of sort of Microsoft Azure because it's what I know best, right? When we think about the model that the industry sort of rallies around called platform as a service, right? Which means I don't have to worry about the networking and the server underneath. Those services you're using, and you gave a great example of Azure Functions, right? Or web apps, right? Or app service, or any of these things. There's still configuration for these things, right? And as an organization, the developers might just want the biggest and beefiest IaaS box or serverless function to run, but organizations have budgets and things they need to manage against. They also want to control who has access to these things or not. So for any of these components, there is still configuration that needs to be done. Now, the first solution you're deploying might require configuration A and the next one configuration B. So you can get smart in your DevOps pipeline and stuff like that to be able to insert effectively variables and everything else so that 90% of that scripting and everything else is the same, but you're just injecting basically based upon this app and its needs, this is what it requires. Or when you get really good at this stuff, you can have a bit of a dynamic thing, right? And this is the power of some of those PaaS components as well, not that we're focusing on that heavily, is that they can basically expand and contract based upon the need of what your organization is doing, right? So, I could spin up one function if that's all I need to service something, or a million, right? There's cost implications behind what you're doing with these things, but that is what it allows you to do. So by having these pipelines effectively to be able to deploy this, I can respond to the real world situation very quickly. So I'm not wasting valuable resources, right? Or under provisioned and losing customers, clients, great experience with them, right? So serverless or traditional Windows, Red Hat Linux workloads and stuff like that, it doesn't really matter. All these things can effectively be scripted. And I'd still classify that as infrastructure as code from that standpoint of defining these things. And in the cloud world, it's just a lot easier because it was built that way to begin with, right? And common things we see is if you're living in the Microsoft world, ARM templates, right? Are big things. For the people that are in that world, start looking at Bicep, right? They love this whole ARM theme. Bicep, right? And curl and stuff like that is coming forward. But for a lot of other organizations, we see a lot of people rallying around things like HashiCorp Terraform, which is a very common solution that's out there that also can insulate people if they're doing multi-cloud type strategy, so that it's less of a burden on their organization to understand the different nuances in each of the clouds.
And so I love that you kind of brought us over to here, because I was going to ask you about tooling, right? You mentioned at the top, it's like DevOps is not like, maybe once upon a time it was about the tooling, and then like it's not really about the tooling, but tooling is still very much so an important part of the world and the life of a DevOps engineer or an organization doing DevOps engineering. So, I've heard you say several times in the past, it's like tooling for this kind of space is all about kind of accelerating with confidence, right? So how do I, as a DevOps engineer, help with that? Like, how do I bring these tools in, or better yet, what am I supposed to be talking about in terms of tools that would help me do that?
It's a great question, and there's many layers behind it that could go on a great conversation. So every organization, unless they're just really starting after they listen to our podcast,
Of course,
has existing tooling in place, right? They have gaps as well, and some of these things are long-term commitments, so contractual, right? That money's been spent. Other things are just favorite things, right? That people bring along. I sort of look at the tooling, and even if we look over the last 2 years of commercial products versus open source, I had this one slide that probably had no less than 300 different products based upon the different aspect of sort of that pipeline or that process that people are doing and the roles that they play of what could play a part, right? And it's a challenge for organizations, because you don't want to start with something only to have that tool chain no longer be around, right? Because you're spending time doing that. However, you have to have a mindset when approaching this that, you should constantly be looking at, how can I simplify? How can I harden this? How can I provide more? So it's not a pick the tool and you're done, right? Just like a lot of things in life, right? Like this is a journey, right? And you need to look at that. So, when we work with our clients, right, we say what we see as common things out there and what has worked and what hasn't worked, right? And getting an impartial sort of third party to have those conversations, I think, is important, right? Because, coming from the different vendors, right, it's always going to be a bit biased. And if you go in thinking it's not biased, then that's bad on you, right? So you have to do your homework and stuff like that. So from a tooling type standpoint, when I think of some of our DevOps engineers, they've come from different walks of life, right? And you brought this up earlier, right? We've talked about developers, and a lot of DevOps folks traditionally have come more from, I'll call it the IT pro landscape, right? And security landscape and stuff like that. And then started to learn the practices of DevOps and stuff like that in the tooling, right? The familiar with like source code management, right? And some of the scripting stuff. We've had people cross from many different lives to become phenomenal, DevOps engineers, I'll use air quotes for that, for what that means, right? And for our developers, they had to learn more about security. They had to learn more about networking, right? Because the solutions are dependent upon all of this. And in the new cloud native world, those are part of the configuration stuff and everything else that you're defining when you're building this app out, or you're thinking about disaster recovery or other things. And for the folks that were coming from the IT world, their big thing was, I had to learn scripting, right? Learning PowerShell, learning Bash at a deeper level, learning source code management solutions, and learning about pipelines, right? CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. Those were more the talks and stuff like that came from the dev world. And so for me, anyone can bridge that. They have to have an open mind as they're approaching that, right? And then you'll have things like Ansible, and Docker plays a big part for a lot of people to move quickly, right? And I'm just going to throw it. I'm going to say bingo.
Just say, like, here comes the term salad. Let's go, bring it all out.
Right? So Docker, but you can't talk about Docker without talking about Kubernetes, right? Or orchestration as the top name, right? As a way to start to migrate applications, but give them some of the benefits of elasticity in the cloud, of moving up and down, before you might move to a true cloud native and serverless architecture, right? That you don't think about servers, but really you still do to a degree, because these things cost money to run, and so you got to take that into consideration as you're building out your architecture. So it's when I talk to clients and we get to honest conversations, it's scary for them because they don't want to make the wrong decision on tooling, right, or on approach behind it, right? And that's where having, whether you try to engage ObjectSharp or you have trusted advisors in the industry, you need to talk to people, right? Because there's many different ways to solve things. There's not one DevOps tool chain that's the best, right? There are many that can work for you, but in the end, as an organization, you really need to look at it saying, how do we make money? Well, like, what are we in the business of, right? And you can have bright people that spend a lot of time piecing all these tools together, but that's not really helping drive your business forward. So you want to look for tools that have a greater amount of adoption, right? And, I'll pick on one right now, like GitHub, right? So GitHub started off as, very much a source code and a destination for developers doing open source, right? And if we think over the last, heck, even year, but let's say couple of years, right? It started to add capabilities to allow teams to collaborate at a tighter level and everything else. And because they were coming from the open source world, they have a unique perspective and understanding of allowing massive amounts of people across multiple organizations to collaborate. Well, if we think about enterprise organizations, they have a bunch of different teams that are inside doing great things, but they aren't always the best at sharing. Right. And so another buzzword that's come out, right, is something called inner sourcing. And I remember when I started at Microsoft, right, and that was
do the math,
14 plus years ago. We'll just leave the plus in there. One of the first conversations I had with a very large organization, very complex development, basically on I think it was 4 or 5 different continents. And they were adopting Team Foundation Server at the time, right? Team Foundation Server, for the people on this listening in, was sort of the early names, that changed to VSTS and became a cloud, and eventually now we call it Azure DevOps. Right. But they were basically saying, okay, this is great. And there were a lot of extensions for TFS at the time, which was awesome. But they said, how do I share what one team has basically built as a component? It's almost like object-oriented programming with another team, so that they just don't recreate things, which costs more for testing, costs more for deployment, and causes security issues because we're all secured a bit differently. He goes, how do I create effectively inside my organization this ability to basically share this stuff, and who was the expert behind it, which gives them credibility internally and feeds their ego and helps them, right, on their career path? How do I do that, right? And if I think, of what inner sourcing has, and once again, this is evolving over time, that is what it allows these organizations to do. Once again, allowing the organization to move quicker, to address business challenges, to take advantage of business opportunities in a more secure way, right? And so inner sourcing, for the people that aren't familiar with it, look it up. There's lots of things out there. To me, it's important, right? Because software is more prevalent now than it ever was before. You know, to quote some people out there, every organization is a software company, right? Or is becoming more of a software company. So it's best to learn from these best practices of people that have been able to do this successfully as the number of those people grow, right? To allow your organizations to still be sort of agile as it's trying to meet its business needs. There was a lot of buzzwords in that sentence.
I'm not even going to
Bingo.
I'm not even going to try to count them. But what I did, like what I was hearing as you were telling that, that story was a lot of, I guess, some tidbits for the listeners to kind of think about. It's like, what should I be thinking about as I go down this, whether it's just starting or whether it's finishing off or in the middle of a DevOps journey, how do I do all of that? So what would be the one takeaway that you suggest as someone who's thinking about this? Again, maybe one takeaway for a person who's just starting, and then maybe a takeaway for someone who's already deep into it.
So great question, right? And like, I'd say it starts with having those open and honest conversations and starting, right? This isn't, back in the day, right? And this will show a bit of my age, the internet really didn't exist and was connections between universities, right? And Unix was the predominant sort of system. And someone from Berkeley basically put it this way to me: the Unix environment tried to create perfect things, right? And Microsoft, right, was about addressing the problem, knowing that it wasn't perfect, but there were other challenges they still had to address along the way. DevOps is a journey, right? You need to start with one foot going forward, right? And there are key things behind it that, you need to look at the people in the process and how they work together, right? And the tools have to support that. Automation is where a lot of people sort of start with this, but it sort of depends upon where the organization is at in adopting cloud or not, because that brings in other conversations that allow you to do infrastructure as code much more clearly defined, right? So, but to me, it has to be centered around, what is the business trying to achieve? How are we being pressed, right? Like, is the business saying, I need to get more releases out there and quicker sort of releases, right? And then you start to look at how you have to rejig, I'll call it your people, your organization, your process, and the tooling to support that, right? But it has to be tied. I'm so tired of executives reading the latest book of the day and wanting to do enterprise Java beans, or everything has to be MongoDB, right? And technology is technology, right? It has to be aligned to what do we need for the business, right? And when we're dealing with public sector customers, it's about being more responsive to get services out. When we were dealing, in this COVID crisis with some of our clients, right, it was about automating a process for screening before you come into the hospital to reduce risks and lineups, and then automating a scheduling system, right, as opposed to having people on the phone in a backlog for weeks, right? Those are real business drivers. And then you have to look at it and say, we're going to have to update this process as we go. And that's where DevOps fits in. We can't look at requirements for weeks and then create new infrastructure and 2 months later do this, right? Like that's not acceptable, right? As we're dealing with COVID or with business challenges, right? That could be, unfortunately, the death, right? For businesses and everything else. So for me, it starts with that step. It starts by doing some research yourself and pulling in some people that can be those trusted advisors to give you some input to assess what's working, what's not. This client I mentioned earlier that I was talking to about DevOps, right, that call a couple hours ago, he was saying, I want you to listen in to hear what's going on between the different groups and how they're trying to do things, so that you can be a voice that has more experiences and give us some guidance, right? Be our Sherpa and help guide us along. And maybe that's going to reflect to some tooling changes. Maybe it's going to reflect to some process changes. Maybe it's just going to be instilling confidence in the people that even though this new way is different, right? And different means you've got to work at it, right? Because you don't have the muscle memory yet. But there's going to be benefit for you as an individual and as an organization going forward, right? So that's what I'd say, but like every journey is a bit different because everyone's starting from a slightly different position, right? And I've met smaller organizations that didn't really know what DevOps was, doing it, right? Because it's what worked for them, and it's what allowed them to basically, survive and thrive in the environment that they were in.
So it kind of sounds like you're saying, you know what, like first things first, before jumping to a solution, before jumping to, again, what we're used to, which is jumping to tools, or I should say what we're used to seeing people do. It almost sounds like, the people who are thinking about and looking at DevOps, it's you have to be a listener first, and you have to be listening to what is needed, because the solution might actually be different, right? And DevOps isn't necessarily about the tooling and whatever. It's actually about that entire process of delivering value. So like I really love that, it just kind of hit home as you were saying. That's like, wow, like part of the skill set of a DevOps engineer is and should probably be right up front is as a listener, not as a technologist, but as a listener to see what the business needs.
Yeah. And it's very, in all my years, I have trouble doing that. I want to jump to solutioning, as a lot of us do. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? It's about seeking to understand their current situation, understand the people, right? So that you can guide that map going forward, because change is difficult. Even if people perceive that change is for the good, it's difficult. And when we're under more stress, working more remotely as we are right now and for the foreseeable future, I know that changes the way, from the podcast that you did before, right? It changes the way that we have to work and work with people, right? And DevOps is no different. This is about people, right? And it's about people doing their best things to solve complex, basically, problems, right? To help the business that they're working for at the time.
So is it safe to say, Jeff, then, so that's kind of like for the person who's just starting off, but is that safe to say that that would also be a takeaway for someone who's in the journey already, to say, rather than start doing that, it's almost like saying, continue doing that, right? Continue to be a listener, continue to be looking at what the business is asking for, the value that you need to deliver to the business, and solution your DevOps process and your DevOps tools accordingly. Is that kind of accurate?
Very accurate, right? Like, as I said before, like, it's not a destination or do once and you're done, right? There are constant best practices. And if we look at some of, companies that have done DevOps well, a lot of enterprises will never reach that level, and nor do they need to do what they need to do to the business. But they can look at some of their best practices and their learnings and adopt what makes sense for them. Remember, every company understands their business far better than any consultant could ever do, right? What outside people bring, right, is an understanding of what has worked for other organizations, right? And it's the combination when you get those people, and once again, getting to that point of those honest conversations, because some of these things people don't want to admit, right? Like, it's like me, having a chocolate bar on my desk, and I don't want to tell my wife, but I like to snack on it, right? No, luckily my wife will never listen to this podcast.
But, I won't tell her either.
But like, to me, it's getting to those honest conversations quicker inside of the organization, and not the finger pointing and everything else, and rallying around what is it that we're collectively trying to do, right? And constantly just looking at that, right? And separating, I'll call it, which is hard sometimes, the people from the process and the things that are going on. And you're amazing at that. When I talk to you, you're so good at that, right? And yes, you're blushing now for the people that are just listening on audio. But to me, that's important, right? Because for people to truly adopt new habits and everything else, it has to be practiced, but it has to be done in a safe environment that they feel comfortable putting an idea out, maybe even if it's not a great idea, but that they aren't going to be shamed for it, or reprimanded, or heaven forbid, somehow penalized from a job standpoint. So, like, to me, that's the importance of senior leadership and helping organizations do these changes, right? It's not just about the developers or security people we talked about. When you talk about adopting DevOps, it's a cultural change that has to start at the top going down, right? In the end, the results, I think, for most organizations are absolutely phenomenal through this. But when you're adopting this, there's going to be ups and downs, right? And the management, just like a good parent, has to create an environment that is comfortable for people to be able to fail, maybe fail quickly, as they like to say, and get back up and try again.
Okay, so just as we kind of take us out here, last thoughts. I was trying to hold it back, but like the coach in me is coming out, and I'm just like, I'm gonna say it. You tell me what you think. It sounds like from what you're saying, typically we talk about CI/CD in terms of like an actual software pipeline and whatever. I propose, right, and tell me what you think. I propose that from now on, we also start thinking about CI/CD as it relates to DevOps, where you're doing continuous like if we look at the DevOps process or the DevOps adoption at an organization, we can look at the adoption itself as CI/CD, continuous integration of best practices, continuous integration of business needs, and then a continuous deployment of updates and incremental changes, subtle changes to the DevOps process, the DevOps tooling, to be able to support all those things that we just heard about.
That's
How does
pretty
that
deep.
sit with you?
I love it. And something I've used in the past is, if we just play on words for CI/CD, because they're just acronyms, right, is continuous improvement and continuous development.
That's right.
Right? Because that refers more to the people and the process, whereas CI/CD in its very nature really is just talking about an asset that you're getting out there.
Right.
And, once again, none of these assets are created, right, or happen without the people.
Well, thank you for joining me here. It was indeed a very great conversation, and I hope that as everyone's listening in and kind of thinking about, oh, okay, well, how does all of the things that you said affect me, both either as an aspiring DevOps engineer, as a current DevOps engineer, or even better yet, working with DevOps engineers. So thank you for all that insight, Jeff, and look forward to future conversations on the topic, as I'm sure DevOps will continue to mature throughout time.
This podcast is brought to you by ObjectSharp. Whether migrating workloads to Azure or building net new cloud-native solutions leveraging the power of PaaS and Serverless, or implementing DevOps and Agile practices within teams or across the entire organization, ObjectSharp has been helping companies with their digital transformations for over 20 years. Learn more at ObjectSharp.com or connect on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. ObjectSharp is a Central Logic company.